Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellbite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. The Rise of the Sentinels event has mostly concluded. There's one more thing that's going to be coming out tomorrow, I believe, so there is at least one more thing that may or may not have an effect on the video today, but it's mostly done, so I feel like it's a fine time to discuss the event and how I think it went. Now, two caveats before we begin. First of which is that this video will contain spoilers. If you intend to grind out the rest of the event yourself or watch a recap video or what have you, do so before watching this, because otherwise you will get spoiled. I'm not holding anything back here, guys, so you will get spoiled if you watch this and don't want to be spoiled, so just keep that in mind. The second is that I'm going to sound very negative at parts of this video. I want to emphasize that no matter what I say here, especially for the benefit of any rioters that may be watching this video, I really want more lore events. Small, medium, large, for skins, for champions, for major plot points, minor plot points, new plot points. I don't care. I want more lore events like this because there is something really cool about seeing the plot move forward in Runeterra, the story move forward, the characters move forward. There's just so much that I enjoy about this event and that I like that we finally got an opportunity for these things to happen, and I really want to emphasize that I want more of this in the future. Regardless of my problems with Rise of the Sentinels, I love that they did this, and I definitely want more of this in the future. So let's go ahead and talk about the good here. First of which, I know I talked about, prior to Sentinels of Light, I really wanted to have things develop and the plot move forward, and some things did change, and I think generally for the better. Vayne is now a Sentinel of Light for Demacia, which I think fits her character. She was already sort of a shoo-in for the Sentinels in the first place, so it makes total sense for her to be there. She's almost a better fit for the job than Lucian because, Lucian was he didn't like magic, but he also was kind of okay with it, and Vayne hates it, right? Like, Vayne's the kind of person who can't stand it, so I think it's fine that Vayne became a Sentinel of Light. It kind of moves her story forward. I'd love to see some updates to her bio now, but definitely a good thing for her moving forward. Viego has been deposed, and his place is Thresh as the big bad evil guy of the Shadow Isles, which makes the Lucian, Senna, and Thresh conflict a little bit less of a personal thing and more impactful. Now it's not just Senna and Lucian trying to deal with their personal nemesis, but also them trying to deal with one of the sort of major nemeses of the plot entirely. So that's kind of a cool thing. It's a little bit of a weird choice. I feel like if anyone was going to step up and fill the power vacuum in the Shadow Isles, maybe it would have been like Mordekaiser or somebody sort of taking control of that power. But suffice it to say, I don't really care too much. That's fine, I guess. And I do like some of the other development that Riot did for some other characters. We did have Irelia learning that not all Noxians are evil butchers, which does have more than just Riven. If you consider Kayn, for example, was a child soldier from Noxus who got drafted and almost died. Talia was intended to be used as a magical weapon by Noxus. So there are other characters that kind of fell into this trope. So if Riot especially do introduce some other Noxian characters that come to Ionia but don't have an intention of fighting, this could be kind of a cool thing for them to showcase and for them to kind of say, hey, look, Irelia, obviously she had an issue with Riven at first, but she kind of acknowledges from here on out that there are some good people going forward. You have Diana, who learned that the Lunari do still exist, so she kind of has more motivation to maybe even, start fighting on their side rather than just trying to make peace, but maybe she tries to be like, oh, well, maybe if I actually have followers, maybe we don't need to make peace with the Solari. And I do like that part of the mystery of the Maiden of the Mist was resolved in a manner that was friendly to the lore buffs, because they did kind of hint about these kinds of things for a long period of time, so it's nice to have confirmation of kind of who or what the Maiden of the Mist was. I did quite enjoy that. Moving on to some of the things that I thought were fine. They weren't good, but they also weren't as bad as I think a lot of people were making them out to be. The writing is off, but I think it's mostly serviceable. There's a caveat here, of course, because there always is with me, but generally speaking, I feel like the writing is okay. Part of the problem I have is that there are a lot of other issues with the plot, and the bad writing exacerbates it. And I don't want to say it's bad, but I do want to say it doesn't feel appropriate for the kind of story they were trying to tell. Spirit Blossom, it was fine, because Spirit Blossom was intended to be more tongue-in-cheek. It wasn't actually canon lore. It was sort of canon adjacent. So if it's a little silly, who cares? This was intended to be a major lore event, and the writing being a little silly feels off, right? If you kind of get me. It was okay. I think there was too much camp, but for the most part, especially if you consider just the general plot beats, it was fine. The Monster of the Week format does get a little bit jarring, but that's clearly a compromise Riot made between player involvement and the lore, right? You didn't just want to have the Sentinels just randomly find all these people. You need to come up with an explanation for why they're roaming around picking up Sentinels and sort of building up this team over time. I felt like it was an okay development method. It did end up causing some other questions that they unfortunately didn't answer, but I felt like it was all right. I don't hate it, but I don't love it. And some of the minor story things that people had problems with, I think are actually okay. I know the Graves and Vayne thing people were really, really upset about, especially over on Twitter.com. But I don't think it was as bad as some people implied. Vayne, like, never, ever reciprocated with Graves. So I think the odds of this actually being a thing going forward are slim to none, I would say. Right, like, even if Riot wanted the ship to happen, it's hard to make an argument for it when Vayne literally never replied to Graves in the affirmative. In fact, she was more okay with Flesh Thresh than she was with Graves, which is saying something, and we'll talk more about that later. The other thing is the Sentinel base is mostly being destroyed. I know people were making, a big deal about every single Sentinel base they go to is destroyed. I do agree that to a certain extent, it shouldn't have been every single base. Like, you would expect the Sentinels to be slightly more competent at their job, but there are some regions that they teleport to where it sort of makes sense. Ishtal, as far as the Sentinels know, is a jungle in the middle of nowhere, because Ishtal has not revealed itself as an actual nation yet, so, okay, fine, we're gonna abandon this one because it's literally a jungle in the middle of nowhere. Why are we even here? The Freljord, are you kidding me? That's in the Arctic and nothing ever happens? Nah, Sentinels are totally bailing on that one. So, like I said, there are a couple of things where I'm sort of like, those bases being destroyed, fine, sure, whatever. However, in regions where there were active Sentinels, like when they go to Shurima and the base is fine and Ukshan is there, like, that makes sense. So then why in Piltover and Zon isn't the base intact, right? Ada and Des are there. In the Serpent Isles, which is where the Baru Sentinel comes from, if you're unaware, the Serpent Isles are where Bilgewater is. Where is the Baru Sentinel? It kind of doesn't make sense why he isn't actually there when, by all accounts, he should be. He should be the Sentinel for that region, right? And they should have an HQ there. So it was fine. I feel like they went a little too hard on all the bases are destroyed. There are no more Sentinels. That felt a little weird, but I think it's mostly okay. Finally, here, moving on to the bad things. And I think really I can sum these up with two sort of main things, which will require a little bit more explanation. And I'll kind of go through and talk about some of my individual plot issues here. But I think one of the biggest things here is that Riot were not very respectful of their own IP. And this is sort of a really big problem, right? Because you should be the one who cares the most about your IP if you're the one who makes it. And it felt like Riot just kind of played fast and loose and didn't really pay attention to a lot of things they should have. They kind of ignored the cosmology of their own IP, and then they cheapened a bunch of things that might have been more impactful for just the sake of saying, well, we want it to go down this way, or, hey guys, remember this thing? This is totally a thing. We're going to name drop it because it's a thing you're going to recognize, and like that just makes it feel kind of cheap because it doesn't matter if we recognize it if it's not being used properly. Examples of these. Olaf's True Ice axes have literally been shown in canon to be able to harm creatures of the Shadow Isles. I mean, in Shadow and Fortune, he literally fights a bunch of Shadow Isles Mistwraiths, and he even fights a Spectral Lindworm that he killed in the flesh previously, and then its ghost came back and he killed it again with the same exact axes. So there's really no argument to be made that Olaf's axes should have had no effect on any of the creatures, right? Like, that's just straight up untrue to the canon lore that Riot themselves have written, which is doubly bad then because Riot remembered enough that Olaf and Lucian have met each other before because it's in that exact same story, but then they didn't remember that aspect of Olaf's axes existed. Similar things with other weapon arguments. Diana's Moonsilver Blade, which is literally a celestial weapon, that should have been able to harm wraiths. I guess they never really talk about it too much, but I do feel like they probably should have said, hey, Diana, you actually do get to use your regular weapon against the wraiths because that kind of makes sense. And they sort of just don't do that. And it's like that with a couple of other sort of things that they change and reasons why they give characters different weapons. There's a more egregious example of this, though, which is Aurelia's blades, where it sort of doesn't make any sense for Aurelia to be able to control these other blades, given that the implication, at least, and maybe Riot will clarify this later, but the implication is that the only reason Aurelia can control the blades she does is because those blades are the remnants of her family crest, which she's able to manipulate using her dancing and channeling the spirit of Ionia through it. The double facet here is the blades she gets as part of being part of the Sentinels are not her family crest, so why would she be able to control them? And the spirit of Ionia was literally ruined, right? Karma was ruined, and therefore the spirit of Ionia was. So again, why is Aurelia, with both these things being true, how is she able to control these blades and actually fight with them? That doesn't really make any sense. And moving on to things that are just kind of cheapened, I would say the Black Rose especially is one that kind of bothers me, that they have this door that leads to one of their sanctums just out in the open. Knowing LeBlanc, that room should have been protected from magical detection as well as physical. Like, the Black Mist should have had a harder time finding it. I wouldn't be surprised if, like, Viego or Draven were leading a physical search for the door, because it feels weird that the Black Mist just kind of knows where to go. And then it especially is weird that there's just this door out in the middle of nowhere, right? Like, why is that there? That doesn't make the Black Rose feel very intelligent at all or very threatening. It just makes it feel like LeBlanc doesn't know what she's doing, which is not really true to the character at all. She's the kind of person with plans within plans. Or moving to Demacia, Demacia apparently having no organized resistance at all against the Mist, even though they're the one nation in the entire world of Runeterra that should be the most protected against magical attack, right? Even to the point where their walls are designed to absorb magic. And it would be different if Riot had said, you know, the Petricite walls are crumbling under the strain of trying to absorb all of that magic from the Black Mist, and their soldiery is being spread thin because of Hecarim raids in the countryside, which they kind of got with a story they released previously, but there just wasn't enough done to represented in the visual novel, and the visual novel was supposed to be the one canon telling of the story, right? So for Riot to just not do the work in the visual novel to set the stage for us in any of these regions, or to really show anything what these regions or these nations are actually doing to combat the Black Mist, is just kind of lazy writing to me. It feels like they really said, well, we're going to go totally rule of cool on this, and you can imagine whatever you want, but not having actual textual things to see is completely different, and it may as well have not happened. And finally, Yorick providing Waters of Mist to the Sentinels, or Waters of Life to the Sentinels. If he was planning on dying, or if the Black Mist was, like, gonna go away afterwards, or at least he assumed it was, then it could have been, like, a heroic sacrifice, like, yeah, I may not last very much longer, but you guys, if you succeed, I'll be fine. But as it is, it just flies in the face of his official lore, where he couldn't spare even a single drop for a man who was sort of in a bad spot and was dying, and he could have spared some of the Waters of Life, but he didn't, because he knew if he did, he would be subsumed by the Mist. And that's the sort of thing, again, that you just look at and you say, okay, do you guys read your own lore, you know? Like, not to put too fine a point on it, but it does feel like Riot just weren't paying attention to their own lore or their own things that they've established previously. There's also an issue with poor characterization. There's a lot of plot things that are just kind of convenient, and there's a lot of characters that just kind of don't feel like they act as they should. The biggest thing here is Lucian listening to Thresh and making a deal with Thresh. Like, any interaction with Lucian and Thresh should involve Lucian shooting at Thresh until Thresh either dies or runs away. It should never involve Lucian listening to anything Thresh has to say unless it's under duress, right? If Thresh had taken the rookie captive and then kind of said, hey, Lucian, you have to listen to this deal I have for you. Okay, sure, fine. I could maybe believe that that's a thing that could happen. And then afterwards, if he's like, okay, you have to make this deal with me or I won't let the rookie go, then maybe I could see Lucian making the deal. But as it is, there's no duress. It's literally just Thresh walking up and saying, hey, buddy, I got a deal for you. And Lucian's like, yeah, well, you fridged my wife for ages, but I'm okay with listening to you. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. Or Vayne saying Thresh is hot. This is the woman who killed her own mentor and liked it the second that mentor showed she was a magical creature. Why would she even remotely joke about it? And again, this is the character whose joke is, I have no time for nonsense. She doesn't joke. So it's just one of those things that you can tell Riot are trying to be funny, and they're trying to be lighthearted as they were with Spirit Blossom, but it just comes across as Riot not knowing their characters or not knowing their own canon, rather than saying, you know, yeah, we're trying to do this deliberately, right? It just doesn't make sense. And then some other cheapened things some other questions that just kind of come up and are never answered, but also really needed an answer. The Lunari just happened to be hiding in this random cave that Diana walks into. Like, that's it. That's how she found out that they were there. That feels very coincidental. There are a lot of questions that aren't answered that should have been. Gwen in the Hallowed Mist, for example. As we find out, there are a bunch of other fetters that have fragments of Isolde's soul in them, but Gwen is the only one who not only came to life, but became a full human. There's no explanation for that. There's no explanation for where the Hallowed Mist comes from, or why she can use it where none of the other fetters seem to be able to, including Senna, who's able to use Black Mist instead. You know, they're the sort of questions that you kind of say, okay, well, is there going to be an answer to this, or is this just something that we don't get an answer to, I guess, right? Like, you know, you needed an answer for this, and this was the perfect event to explain those kinds of things, and yet Riot haven't done that. Maybe because they want to leave the mystery of Gwen's history up in the air. But then there are even other things, too, such as why Viego is so strong. They've made some random comments about Vex supercharging him, but there's no actual textual reason for his power to exist. And how come Viego never made a move to do this beforehand? Like, surely a man as obsessed as he wouldn't have waited for the perfect opportunity to start something like the harrowing. He just would have done it immediately. So again, you know, why wasn't that explained? And then, of course, the very end, where Thresh is able to start controlling the Black Mist. Viego could, because he was literally coming, it was like literally coming out of him. That's why he could manipulate the Black Mist, but how come Thresh just gets to control it now? There's no explanation really given for it other than Thresh says, well, there was a bunch of Black Mists hanging around and now I can control it. There's just no explanation there, right? And I think this leads to my second point here, which is that nothing really changes after this event. If you guys remember Burning Tides wasn't even that big. It was one region, but at least Burning Tides kind of said, you know, hey, we're going to have... we're going to have Graves and TF are going to be friends again, and Misfortune is going to get a revenge on Gangplank, and Gangplank is no longer the king of Bilgewater. He's been deposed, and then we're going to follow it up with more stories that kind of help continue to develop this story. And instead, this event, which is a bigger plot point, right? This is one of the biggest lore points in League of Legends history, right? The Ruined King has been around, like, since the beginning of the game, at the very least since Season 3, and it has covered every area of Runeterra. It should have led to a ton of destabilization and a lot of changes, and a lot of us seeing how various different nations and characters responded to the harrowing, or the ruination. And instead, nothing happens. We hear nothing about how Swain was dealing with the Black Mist, or Demacia was dealing with the Black Mist, or even, and when we do have it, it feels kind of cheap in some regard, like Piltover and Zon just happening to have devices that protect them against the Black Mist, right? Like, why is that a thing? How come that's just a thing they get to do, Just things that aren't explained well enough for me that kind of lead me to believe, like, okay, why is this a thing? Why don't we get a better explanation for why this exists? And more importantly, the reason I wish we had these explanations is because I would love to see, Riot have an explanation for it, so that way we can see how things will change afterwards. And instead, there is no explanation. There is no reasoning behind it. It just kind of happens, and then everything goes back to the way it was before. And this is even worse when Thresh steps up and becomes the new Ruined King, for example, right? Like, there's no explanation for it, and it means that you could have had the Shadow Isles at least have a downtime, an interim period where no one was in charge, and the Black Mist was maybe still lingering, but it was kind of starting to fade, and then you have a character step up and take control, and that could have been a big plot point on its own. But instead, no downtime at all. We're just going to immediately jump to Thresh being in charge. And it just means that the world doesn't change, so the event feels like it's irrelevant, right? Nothing important happened other than Viego getting fridged. And that's extremely disappointing for a lot of reasons. And so it's just an unsatisfying event with an unsatisfying conclusion at the end of the day. Now, I do acknowledge that Riot had to do a large part of the work for this during COVID, and that this likely had an impact on the overall quality. But I do think that for their first big lore event in years, especially choosing an event like this, that they could have done better and planned better than I think what was obvious that they did. Again, I want more lore events in the future, don't get me wrong, but I do think that if they plan on doing something as big ticket as this, like a Noxian or Ionian rematch, for example, that they really need to do their homework, they need to make sure they handle this properly, and they need to make sure that they're paying closer attention to their actual universe and everything that's going on. And definitely, I think the visual novel format needs to be left behind, unless they plan on making it a more tongue-in-cheek event again like Spirit Blossom. So, anyways, those are my thoughts. I know it was a lot more long-winded today than I normally am, guys, so let me know any of your problems or things you liked about the event down in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts, especially if you're more of a casual lore fan. I would love to hear it if you guys have, things in particular that you're a big fan of and that you want to see more of, right? Especially if you liked, like, the visual novel thing. Let me know that in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I play a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.